In the depths of an ancient library, where dust motes dance through shafts of filtered light, sits a collection of clay tablets that might hold the most terrifying secret in human history. These aren't ordinary records of grain harvests or royal decrees. They're something far more unsettling. Mathematical calculations that stretch across millennia, astronomical observations of impossible precision, and warnings written in the oldest language known to humanity. What if I told you that 5,000 years ago the Sumerians weren't just watching the stars for beauty or wonder? What if they were tracking something deadly? Something that returns in cycles so vast they span the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Tonight we'll explore the possibility that these ancient astronomers recorded not just the memory of catastrophe, but the blueprint for when it would strike again. Before we venture into this labyrinth of ancient warnings and cosmic threats, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you're drawn to mysteries that blur the line between history and survival. And if you're settling in for the night, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient fear connecting us all across the darkness. The story begins not with grand revelations, but with confusion that has puzzled scholars for over a century. When British and French expeditions carved into the tells of southern Iraq in the late 1800s, they expected to find the fumbling first attempts at civilization, simple pottery, crude tools, basic agriculture. Instead, their shovels struck something that defied every assumption about human development. Layer after layer of sophisticated clay tablets emerged from the earth, stacked in chambers that had been sealed when Rome was still a collection of hills and Athens existed only in dreams. These were the records of Sumer, humanity's first known civilization. But what made archaeologists pause in bewilderment wasn't the age of these documents, it was their content. The earliest astronomical records showed no learning curve, no gradual improvement, no apprenticeship phase. Venus cycles calculated to the day, eclipse predictions that could be verified by modern computers, star catalogues that matched the ancient sky with mathematical precision. It was as if someone had lifted a curtain to reveal a civilization that began with its eyes already fixed on the heavens, tracking patterns that should have taken millennia to decode. But they weren't just watching the stars for navigation or timekeeping. They were watching them with the intensity of people who had learned to fear what lurked in the darkness between worlds. These tablets spoke of stones that fell from the sky bringing fire and devastation. They described periods when the very air seemed to burn, when horizons caught flame without earthly fire, and when entire regions were scoured clean by forces that descended from above. The language wasn't poetic metaphor. It sat beside irrigation schedules and architectural plans, written with the clinical precision of people recording observed facts. One tablet recovered from a sealed chamber beneath Sipar records what can only be described as a countdown. A sequence of celestial events followed by descriptions of the burning wind that needs no rain and the day the horizon caught fire. Modern researchers still struggle to explain how Bronze Age astronomers could have predicted atmospheric phenomena with such accuracy, unless they weren't predicting at all, unless they were remembering. The mathematics themselves told an even stranger story. Every impossible calculation followed precise patterns based on the Sumerian base 60 system, the same mathematical framework we use today to measure time and angles. These weren't random numbers inflated by mythology. They were deliberate, systematic records of cycles so long that tracking them required institutional memory spanning dozens of generations. What emerges from these ancient libraries is the portrait of a civilization obsessed not with conquest or wealth, but with watching the sky for signs of returning danger. Their temples weren't just houses of worship. They were observatories designed with sightlines pointing toward specific regions of space during specific times of year. Their festivals weren't celebrations of seasons, but coordinated sky watches during periods of elevated risk. The Sumerians spoke of a time before their cities existed, when knowledge descended from the sky after great waters had receded. They described teachers who appeared in the aftermath of catastrophe, beings who taught the survivors how to rebuild and, more importantly, how to watch for the return of what had destroyed the world before. Modern scholars have long dismissed these accounts as creation mythology, the primitive mind's attempt to explain the unexplainable through divine intervention. But what if these weren't myths at all? What if they were the most important historical records ever preserved, testimonies from the survivors of a global catastrophe so devastating that it reset human civilization? The evidence for such an event has been mounting for decades. Geological research has identified a thin black layer in sediment cores around the world, dated to approximately 10,800 years ago. This boundary contains microscopic diamonds that form only under extreme pressure, magnetic spheres of flash-melted rock, and elevated concentrations of materials found in asteroids and comets. Something struck Earth with enough force to leave these signatures across multiple continents. The climate record shows what followed with brutal clarity. Within decades, global temperatures plunged. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. The megafauna that had survived hundreds of thousands of years of Ice Age fluctuations went extinct within centuries. And the emerging human settlements across the Fertile Crescent, those first experiments with agriculture and permanent architecture, vanished from the archaeological record for over 1,000 years. But when civilization re-emerged in that same region, it emerged with an obsession. The Sumerians didn't just develop astronomy as an academic pursuit. They built their entire society around watching the sky with the intensity of people who understood that their survival depended on seeing the next threat coming. Their astronomical texts weren't random observations scattered across centuries. They were systematic studies of recurring patterns, cycles of danger that returned with mathematical precision. They tracked not just the movements of planets and stars, but the behavior of objects that crossed stellar paths, that scattered smaller lights in their wake, that brought seasons of fire and darkness. What the Sumerians had discovered, and what modern astronomy is only now confirming, is that cosmic threats aren't randomly distributed across time. They cluster in periods driven by orbital mechanics, creating windows of elevated risk that return with predictable regularity. Earth's path through space carries us through debris fields left by ancient comets, streams of fragments that most of the time pose no danger. But occasionally gravitational perturbations concentrate these fragments into denser regions. When our orbit carries us through these concentrated zones, this sky becomes a shooting gallery. Most fragments burn up harmlessly in the atmosphere, creating beautiful meteor showers, but some are large enough to survive the journey down, large enough to explode over cities with the force of nuclear weapons, large enough to alter climate and reshape civilizations. The Sumerians had learned to track these cycles because their ancestors had lived through one. They had witnessed the sky turn against them, had survived the fires and floods and climate collapse that followed, and they had dedicated their civilization to ensuring it never caught them unprepared again. Their tablets weren't just recording the past, they were calculating the future, projecting forward through time to identify when the danger would return. And according to their mathematics, according to cycles they spent 3,000 years learning to recognize, that return was never a question of if. It was only ever a question of when. What they found in those calculations would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about our place in the cosmos. Deep within the mathematical frameworks preserved on clay, the Sumerians had identified something that modern science is only beginning to understand. A pattern so vast and terrifying that it required generations of careful observation to decode. The key lay in understanding what they called the Taurid streams. Ancient astronomers had noticed that certain times of year brought more falling stars than others. Late October through early November, the sky would light up with meteors appearing to radiate from the constellation Taurus. But the Sumerians recognized something that escaped other cultures entirely. These weren't just pretty lights dancing across the heavens, they were warnings. Modern astronomy has confirmed what those ancient sky watchers somehow understood. Earth's orbit carries us twice each year through a vast debris field, created when a massive comet broke apart tens of thousands of years ago. Most of the time, we encounter only the dispersed edges of this cosmic graveyard. Harmless fragments that burn up 60 miles above our heads, creating those beautiful meteor showers that have inspired poets and dreamers for millennia. But the debris isn't evenly distributed through space. Gravitational forces from Jupiter and Saturn act like invisible shepherds, sometimes concentrating fragments into much denser regions. When Earth's path intersects with these concentrated zones, the gentle light show becomes something far more sinister. The Sumerians had witnessed this transformation firsthand. Their tablets describe seasons when the bull constellation brought not beauty but terror. Periods when the sky rained fire for days on end. When objects large enough to survive atmospheric entry struck the ground with devastating force, when the very air seemed to explode overhead, flattening forests and boiling rivers. These weren't mythological exaggerations. They were eyewitness accounts of what happens when a civilization encounters the dense nodes of an ancient debris field. The same phenomena that modern scientists observed in Tunguska in 1908, when a meteor exploded over Siberia with the force of a 15-megaton bomb. The same type of event that shattered windows across 6 cities when a fragment struck near Chelyabinsk in 2013. But the Sumerians had discovered something even more unsettling than the existence of these cosmic bullets. They had learned that their arrival follows predictable cycles. Through centuries of careful observation, they had tracked the periodicities of danger. The debris field intensified roughly every 2,500 to 3,000 years, driven by the same gravitational mechanics that modern computers use to model asteroid trajectories. During these intensification periods, impact risk didn't just increase marginally, it exploded by orders of magnitude. Small airbursts became likely, large airbursts became possible, civilization-ending events became statistically probable. The mathematics preserved in cuneiform weren't random numbers inflated by primitive superstition. They were precise calculations of when Earth's orbit would next carry us through the most dangerous regions of space. The Sumerians had created humanity's first cosmic early warning system, disguised as religious ritual and astronomical observation. Their temples weren't randomly oriented toward aesthetically pleasing constellations. Every alignment had been calculated to track the approach of specific threats. The ziggurat at Ur pointed toward the exact region of sky where the dangerous meteors would first become visible. The observatory platforms at Nippur were designed with sightlines that framed the maximum danger window, providing visual confirmation when the risk period had arrived. Even their festivals encoded practical survival information. The autumn ceremonies weren't celebrating harvest seasons. They mark the beginning of elevated threat periods, times when priests were required to maintain all-night vigils watching for signs of incoming destruction. The rituals that scholars had interpreted as religious devotion were actually coordinated sky watches, a civilization-wide early warning network disguised as spiritual practice. But perhaps most remarkably, the Sumerians had recognized that the threat operated on multiple timescales simultaneously. Annual cycles marked when Earth passed through the debris field each year. Multi-century cycles tracked density variations within the stream. And vast millennial cycles identified the truly dangerous periods when multiple factors aligned to create perfect storms of cosmic violence. They had mapped all of these cycles with extraordinary precision. Their calculations matched modern astronomical data for the structure and behavior of meteor streams with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible for Bronze Age astronomers, unless they weren't working from theoretical models. Unless they were recording observed patterns accumulated across timescales that dwarf modern scientific institutions. The evidence suggests that the Sumerian astronomical program wasn't the beginning of systematic skywatching. It was the continuation of an observational tradition that stretched back to the Younger Dryas impact event 12,800 years ago. Someone had recognized the pattern during that global catastrophe and begun recording it. Those records had survived the collapse of civilizations, the rise and fall of empires, the dark periods when knowledge itself seemed to disappear from the world. And eventually those ancient observations reached the scribal schools of Sumer, where they were refined, expanded and preserved in the most durable medium available. Clay tablets that would outlast bronze, outlast iron, outlast paper and digital storage, carrying their warnings forward through millennia to whoever would eventually develop the technology to understand what they contained. The Sumerians weren't just recording history, they were sending a message across time, a warning calculated to reach the exact moment when their predicted cycles would complete, when the cosmic threat they had spent 3,000 years learning to track would return to pose its greatest danger in recorded human history. That moment, according to their mathematics, is now. Modern astronomical surveys have confirmed what the ancient calculations predicted. Between 2030 and 2040, Earth's orbit will carry us through the densest concentration of the Taurid meteor stream encountered in over 2 centuries. The timing matches Sumerian projections with precision that should be impossible unless their observations were far more sophisticated than anyone imagined. We are living in the danger window they spent millennia learning to recognize. The convergence they calculated would occur when their counts reached completion, the return of the fire they had witnessed before and knew would strike again. The question that haunts researchers isn't whether the ancient warnings were accurate. Modern astronomy has confirmed the threat exists exactly where and when the Sumerians said it would return. The question is whether we possess the institutional memory, the cultural preparedness, the simple awareness that our ancestors spent 3,000 years trying to preserve. They built their entire civilization around watching for this moment. We've forgotten that the danger exists. The implications stretch beyond mere academic curiosity. If the Sumerians truly inherited knowledge from survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, then their astronomical records represent something unprecedented in human history. Not the birth of science, but its resurrection. The careful preservation of observational data across a dark age so complete that entire civilizations vanished from the archaeological record. Consider the logistics of such preservation. Knowledge doesn't survive cataclysmic collapse by accident. It requires deliberate effort, institutional dedication, and most importantly, an understanding of why that knowledge matters desperately enough to risk everything to save it. Someone in the aftermath of global catastrophe made the conscious decision to begin recording celestial patterns, knowing they might not live to see those patterns complete their cycles. This wasn't academic curiosity. This was survival instinct elevated to the level of civilizational mission. The observers who began tracking meteor streams 12,000 years ago understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Cosmic threats operate on timescales that exceed human memory. Without institutional preservation, each generation must learn the dangers anew, and by the time those dangers become obvious, it's already too late to prepare. The Sumerian solution was elegant in its simplicity. Encode the knowledge in religion, make sky watching a sacred duty, transform astronomical observation into ritual obligation, create a priestly class whose entire purpose was maintaining the count, preserving the observations and calculating when the cycles would complete. Disguise a cosmic early warning system as divine worship, ensuring its preservation across political upheavals and cultural changes. But they went further than simple preservation. They built redundancy into the system that reveals sophisticated understanding of how knowledge degrades over time. The same information appears in multiple formats across different types of tablets. Mathematical calculations preserved in astronomical texts. Narrative warnings encoded in mythological stories. Practical observation instructions disguised as festival rituals. Technical terminology embedded in religious vocabulary. Each format served a different preservation function. The mathematics provided precision for those trained to interpret them. The myths made the essential concepts memorable for oral transmission. The rituals ensured the timing would be maintained even if the underlying understanding was lost. The embedded terminology preserved technical accuracy across linguistic evolution. It was a comprehensive strategy designed to maximize the probability that future generations would recognize the danger, even if they lost the ability to fully understand the original texts. The Sumerians weren't just recording information, they were engineering its survival across the collapse of their own civilization. Modern analysis of their preservation methods reveals techniques that wouldn't look out of place in contemporary information science. Error correction through multiple independent sources, redundant encoding across different media, distributed storage to prevent single points of failure, even deliberate obfuscation to protect crucial knowledge from those who might misuse or suppress it. The astronomical data hidden within religious texts, the technical calculations disguised as mythological numbers, the practical warnings encoded as spiritual imagery. These weren't accidents of primitive thinking. They were conscious design choices made by people who understood that knowledge preservation requires more than simply writing things down. They had learned this lesson the hard way. The Sumerian text repeatedly reference a time before the cities, when knowledge was nearly lost entirely. They speak of teachers who appeared after the great waters receded, figures who possessed understanding that predated the catastrophe. These weren't gods in any supernatural sense. They were the keepers of the previous civilization's accumulated knowledge, the survivors who carried forward what could be saved from the wreckage. The pattern becomes clear when you examine how Sumerian knowledge appeared, not gradually developed through trial and error, but suddenly present in sophisticated form. Their mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and social organization all emerged simultaneously, with a level of complexity that suggests inheritance rather than invention. They weren't creating civilization from scratch. They were rebuilding it according to plans that had survived the collapse. This explains the obsessive precision of their astronomical records. They weren't just curious about the sky. They were maintaining a data set that had cost previous civilizations everything to accumulate. Each observation added to a database that represented thousands of years of systematic study, preserved through catastrophe at enormous human cost. Losing that data would mean future generations would face the next threat completely blind. The responsibility must have been overwhelming. Imagine being tasked with preserving knowledge that could save or doom your entire species. Every calculation had to be perfect. Every observation had to be recorded accurately. Every copy had to be checked for errors. A single mistake could render generations of accumulated wisdom useless at the moment it was needed most. Yet they persevered for over 3,000 years, maintaining their sky watch through wars, famines, invasions, and political collapse. Even as the Sumerian language died out and new empires rose over their ruins, the essential observations continued. Babylonian astronomers inherited the work. Persian scholars preserved the texts. Greek philosophers studied the calculations. Roman administrators maintained the libraries. The knowledge survived because it was too important to lose. Each generation that inherited the astronomical records understood, however dimly, that they were custodians of something essential, something that connected them to a deep past and pointed toward a dangerous future, something that demanded preservation regardless of cost. But preservation alone wasn't enough. The Sumerians also recognized that knowledge must be actionable to be useful. Their tablets don't just record cycles and calculations. They provide specific instructions for recognizing when those cycles are approaching completion. Visual cues that would be observable without sophisticated instruments. Timing markers that could be tracked using basic calendar systems. Behavioral protocols for responding when the danger signs appeared. They understood that future civilizations might not possess their level of astronomical sophistication. Political collapse, technological regression, or simple cultural drift could leave their descendants unable to interpret complex mathematical models. So they encoded the essential warnings in forms that could be understood even by societies that had lost the ability to read cuneiform or perform advanced calculations. The mythological stories that speak of fire from the sky, the festival traditions that mark dangerous seasons, the architectural alignments that point toward threatening regions of space. These weren't just backup systems for their primary astronomical records. They were designed to function independently as standalone warning mechanisms, preserving the crucial information in forms that could survive the loss of scientific literacy. It was a comprehensive insurance policy against civilizational amnesia. And judging by how much of their warning system has survived into the modern era, embedded in religious traditions, architectural practices, and mythological narratives that most people no longer recognize as astronomical instruction, their preservation strategy succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The knowledge reached us. The question is whether we still possess the wisdom to recognize it for what it truly represents, not ancient superstition or primitive mythology, but the most important safety manual ever written, a user's guide for surviving in a cosmic shooting gallery, compiled by people who had learned through bitter experience that the universe is far more dangerous than it appears. They paid an enormous price for that knowledge. Lost civilizations, collapsed societies, generations of survivors struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of catastrophe, and they chose to transform that suffering into wisdom to ensure that future generations would never face the sky unprepared as they once had. The least we can do is listen to what they're trying to tell us. To tell us! The most chilling aspect of the Sumerian records isn't what they predicted would happen. It's how precisely they calculated when it would unfold. Hidden within their astronomical archives lies a countdown mechanism so sophisticated that modern computers struggle to replicate its accuracy using contemporary orbital mechanics. The system they devised wasn't based on single cycles or simple periodicities. Instead, they tracked multiple overlapping patterns simultaneously, creating what can only be described as a cosmic chronometer. Venus conjunctions with Jupiter, lunar node progressions, the precession of equinoxes, solar maximum cycles. Each component operated on different timescales, from decades to millennia, but when properly synchronized, they created a master timeline that could pinpoint danger windows with startling precision. One tablet discovered in the ruins of Babylon contains calculations that span over 4,000 years, tracking 40 complete cycles of Venus-Jupiter alignments, while simultaneously monitoring 7 different meteor stream periodicities. The mathematics involved require understanding of gravitational mechanics that supposedly wasn't developed until Newton's era, yet here it sits preserved in clay, calculated by astronomers who used reed styluses and base 60 notation. But the most unsettling discovery came when researchers attempted to verify these ancient projections using modern astronomical software. The Sumerian calculations weren't just accurate for their own time period, they remained accurate across millennia, correctly predicting celestial alignments and debris field encounters that wouldn't occur until our current century. This wasn't guesswork elevated by coincidence. This was systematic modeling of cosmic mechanics by people who understood that the universe operates according to mathematical laws that transcend human civilizations. They had somehow grasped that, regardless of which empires rose or fell, which languages dominated or disappeared, the celestial clockwork would continue ticking toward its predetermined appointments with Earth. The implications force us to reconsider everything we assume about technological development and knowledge accumulation. How does a Bronze Age civilization achieve computational accuracy that rivals modern astronomy? The only logical explanation is that they inherited computational frameworks developed by predecessor cultures with even more sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The deepest layers of Sumerian cities contain astronomical instruments whose precision exceeds anything found in later periods. Stone circles with sight lines calculated to fractions of degrees, measurement devices calibrated for tracking objects across vast distances, observatory platforms oriented according to mathematical principles that weren't officially discovered until the Renaissance. These weren't primitive attempts at skywatching. They were precision instruments built by people who understood exactly what they needed to measure and why those measurements mattered desperately. The technology was already mature when the Sumerians inherited it, suggesting a technological tradition stretching back far beyond the beginning of recorded history. Consider what this means for our understanding of human development. We've been taught that knowledge accumulates gradually, that each generation builds incrementally upon the discoveries of their predecessors. But the Sumerian evidence suggests a different pattern entirely. Sophisticated understanding appearing suddenly, persisting for millennia, then gradually degrading as the underlying principles are forgotten. It's the signature of inherited knowledge rather than original discovery. Knowledge preserved from a previous high civilization that possessed scientific understanding we're only now beginning to match. The Sumerians weren't primitive stargazers stumbling toward enlightenment. They were the inheritors of an ancient scientific tradition, custodians of knowledge accumulated across timescales that dwarf our own technological history. This perspective transforms their astronomical obsession from curious historical footnote into something far more urgent. They weren't developing new science, they were maintaining old science, preserving computational frameworks and observational data that previous civilizations had paid an enormous price to accumulate. Knowledge that had already proven its value through successful prediction of cosmic catastrophes. The tablets make this clear through their consistent references to verification and confirmation. They don't just record calculations, they note when those calculations successfully predicted actual events, when meteor showers appeared exactly as forecast, when climate disruptions followed cosmic encounters according to modelled timelines, when celestial alignments produced the atmospheric effects their frameworks anticipated. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were working prediction systems that had been tested against reality across multiple cycles. The accuracy of past predictions validated the underlying models, providing confidence that future projections would prove equally reliable. The Sumerians maintained their skywatch not from superstition, but from empirical evidence that their inherited knowledge actually worked. But maintaining such complex computational systems across millennia required more than just preserving tablets and training astronomers. It demanded understanding of how knowledge degrades over time and deliberate strategies for preventing that degradation. The Sumerians solved this challenge through redundancy and cross-verification systems that reveal sophisticated appreciation for information theory. Multiple independent calculation methods for the same predictions, different astronomical schools checking each other's work, parallel observation programs tracking identical phenomena from different locations, regular recalibration based on observed versus predicted outcomes, error correction protocols for identifying and fixing computational mistakes before they could compound across generations. They had essentially created a quality control system for astronomical prediction, ensuring that the knowledge they inherited would be transmitted to future generations with minimal corruption. Every significant calculation appears in multiple versions across different archives. Every major prediction includes verification data from independent sources. Every computational framework shows evidence of regular updating based on observational feedback. The level of systematic rigor rivals modern scientific methodology. These weren't casual stargazers recording interesting observations. They were maintaining mission-critical databases under protocols designed to ensure accuracy across timescales, exceeding any individual human lifetime. The survival of their civilization depended on getting the calculations right, and they built their entire knowledge preservation system accordingly. But perhaps most remarkably, they recognized that even the most sophisticated preservation methods would eventually fail. Political collapse, natural disasters, or simple cultural drift could disrupt their computational programs regardless of how carefully they were designed. So they created backup systems that could function independently of their primary astronomical infrastructure. The mythological narratives that encode essential timing information, the architectural monuments that preserve crucial alignments in stone, the festival calendars that maintain skywatching schedules through religious tradition, the linguistic structures that embed technical concepts in everyday vocabulary. Each backup operated according to different preservation principles, ensuring that even catastrophic loss of their primary systems wouldn't eliminate all traces of the essential knowledge. It was a comprehensive strategy for surviving civilizational collapse while preserving the information needed for long-term species survival. And judging by how much of their warning system remains detectable in contemporary culture, despite 5,000 years of political upheaval and technological change, their backup systems succeeded exactly as intended. The knowledge survived because they understood that knowledge must be designed to survive. That information preservation requires more than simply writing things down and hoping for the best. That truly crucial data demands active protection through multiple, redundant systems operating according to different principles and vulnerable to different failure modes. They had learned this lesson through bitter experience. The texts repeatedly reference previous knowledge that was lost during earlier catastrophes, forcing subsequent generations to rediscover essential principles at enormous cost. The Sumerians were determined not to repeat those mistakes. To ensure that whatever befell their own civilization, the astronomical knowledge they had inherited would somehow reach the future civilizations who would need it most. That future civilization is us. We are living in the exact time period their calculations identified as the completion of their cosmic countdown. The convergence point where multiple danger cycles would align to create maximum threat conditions. The moment when all their preserved warnings would become immediately relevant for human survival. The question that haunts every serious analysis of their work is simple and terrifying. If they were right about the timing, if their calculations accurately predicted when the cosmic threat would return, were they also right about the magnitude of what's approaching? The scale of destruction their models anticipated when all the danger cycles reach simultaneous completion? As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the ancient scribes who pressed these warnings into wet clay by flickering lamplight, knowing they would never live to see the future they were desperately trying to protect. They transformed catastrophe into wisdom, suffering into knowledge, ensuring that when the cosmic clockwork completed its vast rotation, someone would be listening. Their countdown has reached zero, their cycles have aligned, and their message has finally arrived at its intended destination. We are the civilization they calculated would need these warnings most. The question that remains, echoing across 5 millennia of carefully preserved knowledge, is whether we possess the courage to hear what they're telling us about the sky above our heads. To understand what that courage would actually look like, we have to go back, not to the abstract cycles and cold mathematics, but to the moment when one human being stood under the night sky and realized what those numbers meant. Imagine a Sumerian astronomer on the flat roof of a ziggurat, thousands of years ago. The city below him is quiet. Oil lamps flicker in narrow streets. The air smells of baked clay, river mud, and distant smoke from hearth fires. Above him stretches a sky without light pollution, a black ocean filled with stars sharp enough to cut. He isn't up there to admire the view. On a tablet in his hand, still damp from the stylus, he's written a sequence of numbers that his teachers learned from their teachers, and they from theirs, back through a chain of memory no one alive can fully recount. That sequence ends with the date that lies within his own lifetime. Until tonight, those numbers were just marks on clay, neat, orderly, comfortingly abstract. Then the first streak of fire appears. It starts as a pinprick, then becomes a bright line tearing across the sky from the region of Taurus, exactly where the tablets said the first herald would appear. A moment later, a second streak follows, then a third. Within minutes, the sky's alive with falling stars. He counts, he times the intervals, he compares what he sees with the projections etched in clay, and with each point of agreement, each match between prediction and reality, the weight of what he's witnessing settles deeper on his shoulders. The tablets aren't theoretical. The cycles are real. The danger is not just for some distant generation. It is for him, for his city, for the people sleeping peacefully under that deceptively beautiful display. He knows the stories his grandparents whispered on cold nights, stories of firestorms that roared from horizon to horizon, of rivers boiling away in moments, of days when noon looked like twilight and ash fell like snow. Stories that elders insisted were not allegory, not parables, but memory. Tonight, watching the sky unravel according to patterns scratched into clay generations before he was born, he understands something terrifying. Those stories were not about the past. They were rehearsals for the future. It is in moments like this that civilizations decide what they will be. They can look away, pretend the danger is too remote to matter, or they can reorient everything, rituals, architecture, education, power structures, around the simple fact that survival depends on paying attention to the sky. The Sumerians chose the second path. Their courage did not look like heroic speeches or dramatic gestures. It looked like thousands of small repetitive actions. A boy learning base 60 numeration by lamplight, a priest making yet another observation of a familiar star, a scribe carefully copying a damaged tablet rather than discarding it, a builder aligning a temple entrance to a specific rising point on the horizon, because the rituals say it must face that way. Each act, insignificant in isolation, accumulated into something enormous, a civilizational reflex, a habit of looking up. We, by contrast, have cultivated the opposite reflex. Our cities blaze with artificial light that drowns out the stars. Our attention is pulled downward into screens and feeds, and glowing rectangles held inches from our faces. The sky has become background noise. The Sumerians would find this incomprehensible. They risk their lives to preserve knowledge of cycles that would not complete for thousands of years. We, who actually live in the danger window they calculated, rarely look up long enough to notice that those cycles exist at all. But if we follow the chain of preserved knowledge forward, through Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Persia, Greece, we find that their warning has never completely gone silent. It mutates, it hides, it changes languages and religious frameworks, yet it keeps surfacing in oddly consistent ways. Take the flood stories. Every major civilization on Earth seems to remember a time when waters rose suddenly and catastrophically, wiping away entire cultures in a matter of days. The details vary. Mountains differ. Names change. But the pattern remains. A world that has grown comfortable, a sky that gives warning signs, a period of neglect or disbelief, and then a deluge that few survive. Mainstream scholarship tends to treat these stories as independent inventions, psychological responses to the universal human fear of drowning, or symbolic narratives about moral decay and renewal. But layered beneath the moral language, beneath the theology and cultural specifics, we keep finding the same peculiar technical details, unusual lights in the sky, thunder that comes before the storm, stones falling from heaven, a noise so great it drowns out all other sounds, days when the sun refuses to appear. Buried in myth are the fingerprints of real events. The Sumerians were not content to let those fingerprints remain vague. They catalogued, measured, cross-referenced. Where other cultures remembered the flood, the Sumerians remembered positions of planets, angular distances between constellations, the timing between celestial alignments and terrestrial catastrophe. They did something even more radical. They tried to map those events onto cycles. In their view, catastrophe was not a one-time punishment or random misfortune. It was part of a system, of repeating interaction between Earth and its surrounding environment. The sky wasn't just a dome of lights, it was a machine with gears. When certain gears aligned, certain outcomes became likely. They realized that to survive, you did not need to predict the exact impact point of every individual meteor. You needed to know when the machine was moving into a dangerous configuration. Our modern world uses similar logic every day. We cannot predict which specific individual will develop a particular disease. We can, however, identify risk periods, environmental triggers, and statistical likelihoods. We build public health policy around cycles and patterns, not individual incidents. The Sumerians did this with the sky. We see the traces of their approach in how they describe time. They didn't just divide the year into agricultural seasons. They tracked watch periods associated with particular constellations, noting which brought favourable omens and which brought heightened danger. These weren't superstitious associations, they were compressed summaries of observational data. When Taurus rose at certain angles relative to the Moon and specific planets, the risk went up. When these angles coincided with particular positions of the Sun and nodes of the Moon's orbit, the risk spiked. They didn't have our vocabulary for orbital dynamics or gravitational resonance, but they had something just as powerful: consistent observations recorded over spans longer than individual human lives. The sky, watched long enough, explains itself. An astronomer who knows he is part of a 1,000-year experiment sees patterns that would be invisible to someone with only a decade of data. Modern science likes to imagine itself as a clean break from ancient superstition. In reality, it is more like a relay race. The baton of observation has been passed hand to hand across millennia, sometimes dropped, sometimes nearly lost, but always picked up again by the few who recognize that their personal lifespans are irrelevant compared to the cycles they're tracking. This is why the Sumerian obsession with redundancy matters so much. They understood that no single institution, no single city, no single library could be trusted to survive the next wave of chaos. So they scattered their warnings across multiple domains: religion, myth, architecture, bureaucracy. We find their fingerprints in temple orientations, but also in taxation records that reference danger years, where offerings must be increased. We see them in agricultural calendars that caution against building new granaries in particular seasons. We hear them in hymns that describe the bull of heaven, not as a metaphor for strength, but as a bringer of scorching winds and fiery stones. We find their logic echoed in later cultures that never knew the name Sumer. Consider a temple built on a distant coastline centuries after Sumer's cities had fallen silent. Its priests speak a different language, its rituals invoke different gods, but the main doorway still frames a specific rising point on the horizon. The highest platform still offers an unobstructed view of the same patch of sky where the Taurid meteors appear. Ask the priests why it is built this way, and they will give you theological explanations. This is where the god first rose. This is where the divine messenger appeared. Myth has covered the original rationale in sacred narrative, but the alignment remains. The architectural memory outlives the story that explained it. Time after time, place after place, we find structures that seem strangely preoccupied with watching particular parts of the sky during particular portions of the year. Archaeologists debate whether these are purely ceremonial, purely agricultural, or purely symbolic. The Sumerian tablets suggest a different possibility. What if ceremony, agriculture, and symbolism were all deliberately chosen vehicles for encoding survival information? We also see a subtler form of memory: taboo. In some regions, ancient texts advise against building in certain low-lying floodplains, not because the soil is poor, but because the waters have claimed this place before and will do so again. In others, legends warn against living near particular mountain valleys that drink the fire of heaven. Later generations, forgetting the original reasons, continue to avoid these places out of habit or superstition. Modern developers, convinced that they are wiser than their ancestors, sometimes ignore those warnings. We know how that story plays out. A dam is built in a valley whose folklore calls it the path of the flood. A suburb spreads across a coastal plain that old myths describe as borrowed land. Engineers perform their calculations. Politicians make their speeches. For a few decades, everything works. Then a rare combination of events: heavy rainfall, tidal surge, or in some cases a small but energetic impact offshore, reminds everyone that the stories were not just stories. The water returns along the paths it has always preferred. Lives are lost. Insurance companies call it a once-in-a-century anomaly. Folk memory calls it inevitable. The Sumerian way of thinking does not see such events as isolated tragedies. It sees them as echo points in a longer pattern, warnings unheeded by civilizations that have lost access to their elders' sky records. Which brings us back to our own age. Modern astronomy has rediscovered the Taurid stream. High-precision instruments have mapped its densest lanes. Computer models show how fragments cluster under the gravitational influence of giant planets. We track individual near-Earth objects with growing accuracy. We classify them, name them, plot their orbits decades in advance. On paper, we are far better equipped than any previous civilization to understand and respond to cosmic threats, and yet, the Sumerians would not judge us by our instruments. They would judge us by our priorities. How many hours per day does our global culture spend focused on the sky, compared to the hours we spend focused on short-term market fluctuations, political squabbles, or the latest viral distraction? How many of our best minds are dedicated to tracking and modelling debris streams compared to the number dedicated to optimizing advertising algorithms or extracting marginal gains from financial instruments? Our telescopes can see farther than any ziggurat roof ever did, but our attention spans have shrunk. The Sumerians would see this as a dangerous imbalance. They knew, from bitter experience, that civilizations fall not only when a rock from space happens to hit them, but when they cannot be bothered to notice that rocks from space exist. Their entire warning system was designed to combat this tendency. Rituals forced attention where boredom might otherwise creep in. Calendars structured time so that no generation could go through life without at least some training in sky awareness. Children grew up hearing stories in which the villain was not just a monster or an invading army, but the sky itself. We tell different stories. In ours, the sky is either a meaningless void or a backdrop for escapist fantasy. Real risk is mundane. Bills, deadlines, minor illnesses. Catastrophe is entertainment, not preparation. When we do think about cosmic impacts, it is usually through the lens of movies that treat them as spectacle rather than as part of a long, cold pattern. The Sumerian tablets urge a different posture. They do not suggest panic. Panic is useless in the face of cycles measured in millennia. They suggest something steadier and much harder to sustain. Disciplined, intergenerational attention. From their perspective, a civilization truly listening to their warning would be doing several things. It would treat sky watching as a basic civic function, like maintaining roads or clean water systems. It would invest heavily in mapping and modelling debris streams, not as a niche scientific curiosity, but as a core pillar of long-term planning. It would design education systems that teach children not just that space is interesting, but that understanding orbital dynamics is directly tied to the safety of their descendants. It would build redundancies into its own knowledge preservation, ensuring that if our digital archives fail, if servers go dark and networks fall silent, essential astronomical data survives in forms that do not require electricity to be read. In other words, it would behave more like Sumer. The irony is that, in some quiet corners of our world, we're beginning to do exactly this. Teams of astronomers run dedicated sky surveys night after night, patiently cataloguing faint-moving specks against the stars. Researchers refine impact probability models. Engineers think seriously about deflection missions, kinetic impactors, even gravitational tractors that could subtly alter an incoming object's path years in advance. When they testify before governments, they often struggle to convey the urgency of their work without sounding alarmist. The events they guard against are rare on human timescales, but inevitable on geological ones. Most politicians operate on election cycles, not thousand-year cycles. The language of cosmic risk does not translate easily into the language of quarterly reports. The Sumerians understood this mismatch instinctively. They did not expect kings or merchants to maintain focus on dangers that might not materialize within their own lifetimes. That is why they created a separate class, the priest astronomers, whose entire role was to think beyond immediate horizons. They paid these observers in grain, land, and political influence, not because they produced immediate economic value, but because they were the guardians of long-term survival. We have our own equivalents: research institutes, space agencies, international bodies focused on planetary defense, but we treat them as departments, not as the spine of civilization. In the Sumerian model, the Watchers were the spine. They would look at our world, our bright cities, our networks of satellites, our telescopes orbiting far beyond the atmosphere, and they would ask a simple question: are you using all of this to continue the work we began, or have you forgotten why we started watching the sky in the first place? To answer honestly, we would have to admit that the picture is mixed. We are in some ways the fulfillment of their hope. We have instruments that can see fragments they never could. We can simulate orbital evolution for thousands of years in the time it takes to brew coffee. We have the theoretical knowledge to understand why the Taurid stream exists at all, but our attention, fragmented and monetized, drifts easily away from long-term threats back toward immediate stimulation. The Sumerian countdown did not end at a single date with a single impact. It ended at the point where multiple cycles they had identified converged, opening a window of elevated risk. Their message was never, "You will all die at precisely this moment." It was, "This is when you must be most awake." That is the real test of whether we have heard them, not whether we can predict the exact size and trajectory of the next object that might cross our path, not whether we can guarantee that no impact will ever occur, but whether, in the period they identified, we choose to be asleep or awake. Being awake in this context does not mean living in fear. It means refusing to look away. It means funding the unglamorous work of monitoring and cataloguing when other priorities clamour for attention. It means building the institutional structures that allow knowledge to flow forward into the future, even if this particular civilization stumbles. The Sumerians had no illusions about immortality. They understood that cities fall, empires crumble, languages die. Their goal was not to protect their own political arrangements forever. Their goal was to make sure that, when the sky turned dangerous again, someone was ready. They did not know that this someone would be a species with orbiting telescopes, global communication networks, and the ability to launch machines into space. They simply trusted that if knowledge survived, potential would follow. When you consider the scale of what they attempted, the deliberate preservation of actionable data across a dark age so profound that even their own names almost vanished, the fact that we can even reconstruct fragments of their warning is astonishing. Clay tablets buried in collapsed rooms, soaked by floods, baked by fires, smashed by invaders, still carry traces of meticulously etched numbers. Modern scholars piece them together like puzzles, their broken surfaces revealing partial equations, incomplete cycles, hints of a chronometer that once ticked with terrifying precision. We do not have every piece. Some tablets are lost forever, others lie unexcavated beneath layers of later construction. There are gaps in the sequence, missing lines, damaged segments where some crucial parameter may have once been written. Does that invalidate the entire system? The Sumerians would say no. They designed their warning with the expectation of loss. That is why certain key values appear in multiple contexts. an orbital period encoded as a sacred number in one myth, echoes as a calendar interval in an unrelated ritual. A danger year referenced in an agricultural record lines up with a stellar configuration described in a hymn. We do not need to reconstruct every line of every tablet to grasp the shape of what they were trying to tell us. Enough of the pattern remains to see the outlines of the machine. We know that they tracked a debris stream crossing Earth's orbit twice yearly. We know that they identified multi-century and millennial variations in its density. We know that they associated certain celestial alignments with periods of elevated risk. And we know that one of those convergence periods falls squarely within our present century. From there, the answer to the question, what should we do, is both overwhelming and disarmingly simple. We do not need to rebuild Sumerian temples or resurrect their priesthood. We do not need to adopt their myths or rituals. We need to recover their posture, attention over apathy, long-term thinking over short-term payoff, redundancy over careless trust in single points of failure. The clay tablets were never meant to be treated as sacred relics, frozen in a museum case for you to glance at behind glass before moving on to the next exhibit. They were meant to be read, understood, translated into action, and then surpassed. The scribes who carved them did not want you to worship their numbers. They wanted you to use them as a starting point. If they could see you now, sitting under a very different night sky, illuminated by the soft glow of a screen rather than by oil lamps, they would not ask whether you believe every detail of their cosmology. They would ask whether you are willing to look up, to learn, to continue the work they began. They knew that the universe would not slow its cycles to accommodate human forgetfulness. We either match those cycles with memory and preparation, or we are repeatedly reset. The Sumerians, standing in the shadow of earlier ruin, chose to fight back in the only way they could, by turning their civilization into a memory machine. As you lie there, listening, centuries of their effort flow toward you through the simplest possible conduit, a story. You're hearing fragments of calculations pressed into clay by hands long returned to dust. You're hearing echoes of observations made from rooftops that no longer exist. You're hearing the distilled anxiety of people who watch the sky turn on them once and refuse to let their descendants face the same danger blind. Their courage was not loud. It was patient, quiet, persistent. The kind of courage that sits with confusion and fear and chooses day after day to watch anyway. We cannot know exactly what waits in the dense regions of the debris stream our planet will pass through in the coming decades. Perhaps we will encounter only small fragments, spectacular enough to light up the sky but harmless in the end. Perhaps one or more larger bodies lurk within, big enough to alter a region, a climate, a chapter of history. What we can know with unsettling clarity is that this is precisely the kind of uncertainty the Sumerians built their warning system to address. Not certainty of doom, certainty of risk. The difference matters. Doom paralyzes. Risk can be prepared for. When you close your eyes tonight, the sky above you will still be there, massive, cold, indifferent. Streams of debris will still be moving along their invisible tracks. The Earth will still be following its long, patient orbit, inching toward intersections mapped out in clay before the first brick of your city was laid. You cannot change that. What you can change is whether you live as though those intersections do not exist, or whether you allow the voices of those who saw farther than their own lifetimes to reach you. The Sumerian tablets do not demand worship. They ask for something much harder. They ask you to remember.